Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are diving into a truly fascinating, honestly almost unbelievable courtroom clash. We're talking about a case where a very rigid legal framework goes toe-to-toe with the actual fundamental laws of physics. The prosecution brought the full weight of the penal code, and the defendant? Well, he fought back not with a lawyer, but with complex mathematical theorems. It is an absolutely brilliant collision of two completely different ways of seeing the world, so let's get right into it.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll be moving through 1. The criminal case from retweets, 2. The court's conviction logic, 3. The complex systems defense, 4. Facts, opinions, and rumors, and finally, 5. The final collision of perspectives. Starting with Part 1, the criminal case from retweets, or how online clicks literally led to prison. We begin with the catalyst for this entire legal event, a PhD physics researcher named Chen Jingyuan, who was arrested at his home simply for retweeting posts on Twitter. It's a pretty jarring premise, right? So let's examine exactly how his online activity was legally classified by the state.
The authorities hit him with a charge called picking quarrels and provoking trouble. Now, this is a really broad, sweeping provision under Chinese criminal law that's frequently used to regulate online speech. Essentially, the prosecution argued that his very sporadic social media activity, which was mostly just him hitting the retweet button on various posts from time to time, somehow escalated into a major criminal offense that deeply threatened society.
Let's look at how fast this all went down. This was a rapid, closed-door sequence. He was arrested in September 2022, indicted in January 2023, handed a guilty verdict by April, and by May, his appeal was totally rejected without a public hearing. That swift progression from his initial detention to his final sentencing really sets the stage for the intense, highly intellectual arguments that happened behind those closed doors.
Which brings us to Part 2, the court's conviction logic and the state's 3 legal pillars. To really get what the prosecution was arguing, we have to objectively examine the specific criteria they used to secure this conviction. They couldn't just say, hey, he retweeted things. They had to meet a very specific legal threshold.
According to the official verdict, locking in a conviction for this charge means proving 3 very specific things. First, subjective intent, that Chen actually knew the information was false. Second, objective harm, meaning his retweets actually caused severe public disorder. And third, that the content itself was definitively classified as a rumor or false information.
Now think about this for a second. How exactly do you prove someone subjectively knew a retweet was a lie? Well, the court pointed straight to his PhD. They argued that because of his advanced degree and high level of education, he inherently must have known the retweets were false and insulting to the national leadership. Literally, his intellect itself became a core pillar of the prosecution's logic.
Moving to Part 3, the complex systems defense. This is where a physicist fights back with actual science. Because Chen didn't just hire a lawyer and use standard legal arguments. Instead, from his prison cell, he used his deep expertise in complex systems theory to mathematically dismantle the state's claims. He essentially put the legal code through a rigorous physics stress test.
Chen just pointed straight at the hard data. He argued, look, I have fewer than 100 followers. And get this, most of them were inactive bot accounts. Plus, he had under 100 total retweets over a span of 20 years. To put that into perspective, your average pet dog on Instagram probably has more viral reach. The court claimed he caused severe public disorder, but Chen essentially asked, okay, where is the mathematical proof of that societal impact?
To back this up, he brings in a hardcore physics concept called avalanche dynamics. In the physics world, this describes how a tiny, almost invisible trigger in a complex system can cascade into massive system-wide disruption. Think of a single snowflake triggering a literal avalanche on a mountain. He used this specific scientific framework to empirically analyze the court's incredibly vague claim of public disorder.
The court basically just stated that his actions disrupted society. But Chen mapped this whole thing out using network topology. He proved that in a complex digital network, his specific account is what you'd call an edge node, basically an absolute dead end on the network map. And scientifically speaking, edge nodes completely lack the structural connectivity required to trigger a systemic avalanche.
He then drops the Galton-Watson extinction theorem into his defense. It's a mathematical branching process. He explains that because of his incredibly low follower count, he had an average branching ratio of less than 1. What does that mean in plain English? It means every single time he shared something, it reached fewer and fewer people until it died out completely. Therefore, the probability of a cascade approach is absolute 0. Holding him responsible for societal disorder, he argued, literally defies the laws of mathematics.
All right, part 4. Facts, opinions, and rumors. The epistemological battle over truth. We are moving past the literal physics of harm now and entering a deep philosophical clash over how to define the very nature of a retweet itself.
When Chen actually sat down and categorized the specific posts used as evidence against him, the breakdown was super revealing. What were they? Well, predominantly abstract art, cartoons, expressions of subjective emotion, like literally just a candle emoji for a memorial, and theoretical political debates. Only a tiny, tiny fraction were actually factual historical records.
So we have this massive collision over what truth even means. The court rigidly labels all these critical posts as objective falsehoods or rumors. But Chen counters by bringing in the philosopher Karl Popper. He argues that art and emotional expressions lack falsifiability, meaning you literally cannot put a candle emoji or a political cartoon into a test tube and scientifically prove it false in a court of law.
And to counter the state's whole assumption that his advanced education guarantees he knows the absolute truth of any given situation, he drops an absolute academic mic drop. He brings up Gödel's incompleteness theorem. This is a foundational mathematical concept, proving that even within a totally perfect logical system, there are things that simply cannot be proven. It is a brilliant way to highlight the inherent limits of human comprehension. The state essentially equated his PhD with omniscience, basically saying, you are highly educated, you must know exactly what a rumor is. But Chen flipped that completely on its head. He stated that a true scholar's defining characteristic isn't absolute certainty. It is actually profound, persistent doubt. Real education doesn't give you all the answers. It teaches you to be skeptical of everything.
This brings us to part 5. The final collision of perspectives, where the clash of paradigms concludes. Ultimately, we have to look at what actually happened when this unprecedented clash between an authoritarian legal bureaucracy and theoretical physics resolved in reality. What actually happens when complex equations meet the judge's gavel? Well, the judicial system remained entirely unswayed by the academic arguments. The Intermediate People's Court rigidly maintained their legal framework, officially declaring that the original judgment found clear facts and concrete evidence, and they rejected his appeal entirely without ever holding a public hearing.
In stark contrast to that, Chen's final prison letter channels historical reformers. He defiantly declares that while the system can absolutely imprison his physical body, it literally cannot alter the laws of logic. He presents his defense not to convince the judge, he knew that wasn't going to happen, but to leave a permanent record of this dialectical clash for the future.
So we've just watched the Gelton-Watson theorem face off against a national penal code. And as our digital world becomes infinitely more complex, you know this tension is only going to grow. When rigid legal frameworks collide with the actual measurable science of digital networks, how do we and how should we define truth and harm? Keep questioning the systems around you.